Hi everyone, my name is Tabitha and I am currently a higher level IB student taking economics, and today we are going to be covering Unit 1.1 of What is Economics. And to make studying easier for anybody who's going to be using this video, I'm going to go ahead and leave the timeframes for each part of the video in which I talk about each of the subtopics. So to start from the very beginning, for people who have never taken an economics course before, what even is economics? Well, economics by definition is known as a type of social science. This means that it is the study of people in society and how they interact with each other. However, economics is more specific to the social science of studying the economy. And the fact that economics even needs to be studied in the first place is completely due to the fact that the Earth is, to all intent and purposes, finite. And for anybody who doesn't know what this means, finite is the opposite of infinite. Okay, so it's just the opposite of infinite, meaning limited. This means that we only have a finite or limited amount of resources. And although the resources used to produce goods and services are finite, all human needs and wants are infinite. So there you have it, an automatic paradox in the fact that human wants and needs are literally limitless. There is always something that we want and always something that we need. However, the resources to produce everything that we want and need are completely limited. Okay, now to begin to link the definition of economics to the actual unit we'll be studying, economics connects to a basic extent of global and humanity concepts that all interconnect with one another, and we're going to be studying the order and logic of that interconnection. Okay, so the first concept we're going to discuss here is scarcity. Scarcity exists because of the conflict between the finite resources available to the world's population and its infinite material needs and wants. So this first concept is literally just a product of that problem that we discussed before, whereby resources are finite, but human needs are infinite. And if you're old enough to be taking this as an economics course, I would assume that you know what needs and wants are. But just to specify, needs to be anything like housing, food, and water, anything that you would need to survive per se. And then wants is just everything that you would want or everything that you could have that would just make your life a little bit easier, but isn't reliant on either killing you if you don't have it or letting you live if you do have it. So that would be like technology, a car, some transport in some places, books, just access, things like that that just makes our lives a little bit easier and a little bit happier. Okay, and now the way that scarcity connects to economics itself is economics is a social science that examines the way that people behave and interact with each other to overcome the problems that arise as a result of the basic economic problem of scarcity. So this first concept here, this is the basic economic problem that we're going to be studying, okay, and we're going to be trying to solve throughout this economics course. Therefore, scarcity also links to another concept called choice. All right, the second concept we're going to be talking about here is choice. It should be obvious that because of scarcity, choices have to be made. And I'm sure by this point, you guys already know what choices mean. It's basically any point in which somebody needs to be able to make a decision to choose between one thing and another. Okay, therefore that we can say that economics is the study of the choices that people make in overcoming the problems that arise because resources are limited, while needs and wants, once again, are unlimited. Okay, so obviously, if we have such a paradox that there is a limit to things, but our wants and needs are unlimited, choices are going to have to be made by economies or society in general to basically balance out scarcity and other problems that arise from it. However, a quick evaluation to keep in mind is that when we refer to people making decisions, this can refer to many different things that we'll talk about in more detail later. Okay, this can relate to firms, consumers, the governments, entire countries. It really depends on the context in which we're talking about and whether we're referring to micro or macroeconomics. But just so you know, in the context of such a social science, any person with this amount of power to make a choice to influence either a complete country's market for a certain product or even just one individual firm is going to in some way impact other people, either in a beneficial or a negative way. So this knowledge must also be taken into account by people who are making economic decisions. Okay, something else that comes with choice is going to be the third concept here, opportunity costs. So really quickly, let's just break down what this means. Obviously, cost is what we lose or what we spend when we buy something. An opportunity, when we put it with cost, basically creates the concept that every time we buy something or every time we spend something on a good or service, we are losing not only the amount of money that we're offering to pay for that good or service, but we're also losing the opportunity to spend that money in other places. So for example, if I had, let me start writing at this point. Okay, so if I spent $50 on shoes, I would be losing not only the $50 themselves, but also anything else that I could have bought for $50. Okay, and anything else that I could have bought, whether it be contributing to food, rent, a t-shirt perhaps, anything that I could have bought would be considered an opportunity cost. Okay, so all economic agents, whether they are consumers, producers, or the government, must make choices about how to allocate the scarce resources available to them. Okay, this is how it connects to opportunity cost for more people than just consumers. So whenever a choice is made by an economic agent, and by agent, we really just refer to consumers, producers, and the government by this point, concerning the use of its resources, something is given up or sacrificed, hence the opportunity cost is made. Okay, and by definition, it is defined as the best alternative foregone when an economic decision is made. Okay, and in terms of terminology maybe used in exams, the term opportunity cost can also be exchanged with trade-off. So if they ask you directly in an exam about an opportunity cost, they'll most likely use this. But if you ever see the term or phrase trade-off in an exam, just really try to connect it to the same theory behind opportunity costs. And remember how just before I was talking about how when making choices in an economy, the agent that makes those choices has a very important decision to make, as everything that they do influences other people. Well, opportunity cost is the main influence on other people that can be caused by an economic agent choosing to do whatever they want with the resources and money that they can and will use. So for example, let's say that the government in France has a $10 billion annual budget to offer to educational systems within the country, and they choose to use $5 billion of that $10 billion, so that would be 50% of their annual budget on funding elementary school programs for younger kids. Anything else, any other place in the educational any other place in their educational systems where they could have used that 50%, that $5 billion, would be the opportunity cost that the government made. And now this would affect people in a good and in a bad way. So for all younger kids, all elementary school kids who would get the extra $5 billion of support to get resources, supplies, and just better teaching equipment and better places to be taught in, would be benefiting from this government choice immensely, clearly. However, all the other educational systems, such as high schools perhaps, that would not get as much of a cut of the annual government budget than if the government did not just decide to spend the 50% on elementary school kids, are losing in this case, okay? They're facing the consequences of the opportunity cost, as now they would not have as much access to the same resources, the same teachers, and the same equipment as elementary school kids would. So it's just really important to keep in mind that when you evaluate opportunity costs in any examples and in any exams in the future, you are considering who is making the choice in this case and who is being most affected by the opportunity costs. All right, next concept is interdependence, and to put it lightly, it's the decisions of one economic agent and how they inevitably impact on other agents. So this word is super close to the word independence, okay, and that means to be independent or separate from something else. This word is the complete opposite. Interdependence means you're depending on somebody else, and enter means that you were linked into somebody else in some way. So this is when the consequences of a choice made by an economic agent are so interlinked into the rest of the economy that it's going to impact other people. And if we go really quickly back to that government example I just used, the decisions of the government choosing to spend that $5 billion on elementary school kids is going to impact elementary school kids and also high school kids for that example. And while I used in this example the government as the agent here, agent within itself is super general as a term, so it can refer to any social demographic, whether it be students, parents, producers, consumers, or much more. And in culmination, all these key concepts are good examples of the dilemmas that all economic agents face when making choices, because resources are limited and we can't meet our infinite needs and wants, unfortunately. So these concepts support as to why economics needs to be studied, as obviously we have found already quite a few problems within the economic system of societies, and we're trying to find a way to fix it now by studying economics. All right, now let's get into more technical terms. Let's talk about goods for a second, okay? There's two types of goods in this case, free and economic, and they are pretty much exactly as they sound, okay? So free goods would be goods that are so abundant in like terms of resource quality and quantity that there is literally no scarcity of it. If there's no scarcity of the good and everyone can have as much of the good as they want, it is called a free good. So examples of this can just be the most basic things that you would ever think of, like air, water, roads, basically any type of public good, which we'll talk about in a different chapter later on. But any type of public good would be great examples of a free good, as it's so abundant that there's no scarcity. Like we're never going to run out of air, and in a logical sense, we're never going to run out of water. And roads, just because one person used them doesn't mean that the ability of it to be used by other people disappears similarly. Okay, and because there's no scarcity of these goods, everyone can have as much of it as they want. Okay, just because I breathe a little bit more air than the person next to me doesn't take it away from them. Okay, just because I walk on the roads a little more often than the person next to me doesn't take the opportunity to walk on the roads from the person next to me. Okay, and on the contrary, we have economic goods, which is basically just the opposite, where an economic good is one that is scarce and whose use involves an opportunity cost. So let's just start by choosing something very generic. Okay, we got phones, we got pencils, books even. I'm just using school supplies just because, well, they're related to the example I just gave, okay? And these would all be examples of economic goods as they are scarce in the sense that if you have 10 books and you give 10 books away, you can't just immediately get more 10 books, okay? They just don't pop out of thin air like air does itself, and whose use involves an opportunity cost. So you don't sell books for free, okay? I'm pretty sure no company will sell books for free when they can make a profit off of it. So let's say that somebody sells a book for $5 and you pay for that book. Well, what did we just say about opportunity cost? Not only are you losing the $5 that you spent on the book, but you're also losing the $5 that you could have used to buy pencils or to save up for a phone plan, for example. And so some economic goods may also threaten another concept, which is going to be the concept of sustainability. Okay, so now the best way for me to explain sustainability in the context of economics would be to consider the following question. To what extent are we actually threatening future generations while meeting the wants and the needs of the current generations? And whether the economic good, or let me put products down here, whether the product applies to the question and how the product answers the question will determine whether it is considered sustainable or not. Okay, so now to think about this in a very black and white sense, we can pretty much divide almost all products into sustainable and not sustainable products, considering the following question. But in reality, it is important to know that products are on a very big range of being from sustainable to unsustainable. But just for the sake of simplicity, we're just gonna start with some extreme examples of stuff that does and does not hurt sustainability for future generations. So to start with a very popular example, let's talk about palm oil for a second. Now, for anybody who doesn't know what palm oil is, it's basically like this really creamy, oily product used in foods like Nutella because it's edible, and also used in body products like body lotions, shampoos, and conditioners. Okay, but the big reason why palm oil is such a big deal and why people even started boycotting it is because, especially in South America, palm oil producers have to cut down so many trees just to get a little bit of palm oil from the actual tree. So the hunt for palm oil from producers causes so much deforestation that it's just killing the environment, and people have been boycotting it over the past 10 years. So in this case, palm oil would be a perfect example of a product that is non-sustainable. Okay, as if we put palm oil into the context of the question, we can really easily answer it. Okay, so to what extent does this threaten the future generations while meeting the wants and needs of current generations? Well, at the moment, palm oil is meeting the current wants and needs of the current generations, as the producers of Nutella and the producers of so many conditioners and shampoos are buying it. So obviously it is meeting the wants and the needs of the current generations. However, the effect that it has on rainforests and the effect that it has just deforesting such huge pieces of land and killing habitats for many animals is clearly environmentally not sustainable, because it would be, in this case, actually threatening future generations, okay, and the ability for future generations to similarly produce the same product, as well as protect the actual world itself, to actually protect the environment, okay? However, on the other hand, there are still many products that are considered sustainable and actually do not threaten future generations. Okay, let's choose a very simple example. Okay, let's choose apples. Very simple example here. But just considering it in a very uninvasive context, we could argue that apples are an example of a product that is sustainable, just because it's not threatening future generations in any sort of specific way. For example, if a farmer goes out and grows 100 apples and then takes them to a market and sells all of them, and he doesn't use any GMOs or anything chemically related to making the apples grow in a certain way or grow a lot faster, then this would be an example of sustainable growth and a sustainable economic product. Okay, because it is meeting the wants and the needs of the current generations. So we currently want apples and we're getting apples, but it's also not threatening future generations. So it's not hurting the environment, especially not as much as palm oil is, and it's not hurting the economy in any specific way as well. Okay, so now with the context of the past concepts we've already discussed, let's go ahead and evaluate the basic economic problem. So when you're evaluating economics or why we need economics in the first place, there's three main problems we need to address that economics focuses on answering. First of all, what should be produced and in what quantities? How should things be produced and for whom should things be produced? So this is pretty straightforward. So what should be produced? Is it food? Is it clothes? Is it cars? Is it technology? And how much of which should be produced? Should you produce 100 apples in one car? Should you produce 100 cars in 5 apples? How should things be produced? Should they be produced ethically? Should they be produced only in a certain country? Only to a certain extent? Should they only be produced during certain times of year? And for whom should things be produced? So who are these products being marketed to? Are they being marketed to the general public? Are they being marketed to everybody regardless of income? Are they being marketed to people of higher incomes? Who are they being marketed to? Okay, and now the answers to all three of these questions determine the allocation of resources in the economy markets systems. Now, this phrase right here, I really want to focus on for a second. This is a phrase you will see come up so many times throughout the rest of your time in IB economics that you really just need to hammer this home, okay? You really have to remember it and remember what it means. The allocation of something means the spread of something. How is something shared or equitably divided, okay? In this case, the allocation of resources would be how are resources divided in the economy's market systems, aka it's answering all three of these questions, okay? And obviously, all three of these questions have to be answered in the first place due to scarcity existing in economies in the first place, which leads to choices needing to be made. Okay, and these choices are often expressed in terms of these three questions to represent this basic economic problem to connect it back. Let's talk about the economy's market systems. Theoretically speaking, there are two different allocation or rationing systems: the free market system and the planned economy, okay? While in reality, all economies are mixed economies, which are a combination of the free market and the planning market. Theoretically, you have economies split completely either on one side or the other, as they differ immensely. All right, so now to go back to the actual bulk of the course, we're going to be talking about two things you might have heard me mention already, okay? We got micro and macroeconomics, okay? The entire IB or AP economics course is going to be split between these two. So really quickly, just to define them, micro means small and macro means big. So when we're talking about microeconomics, it's about economics on a micro or small level. And macro is the complete opposite. We're talking about big economic concepts and how they connect to the world in a bigger way. Okay? But by definition, let me read this to you. Microeconomics deals with smaller, discrete economic agents such as consumers and producers individually, and the choices that they make in response to change in a dynamic world. Microeconomics looks at the ways that consumers and producers come together in individual markets. And on the contrary, macroeconomics looks at the factors affecting the economy as a whole, such as economic growth and the way that well-being is impacted by economic growth. So if you already didn't understand anything I just said about these two, don't worry, we're going to define them in way more detail later on, and as we explain each of the subcontents and each of these two different units, you'll begin to understand them shortly. But one thing I think you should really understand at this point in the course is the phrase of individual markets. That was a really bad line, sorry about that. Let me move that. Okay, sure. Okay, it's individual markets, okay? So markets are going to be split into two separate categories, okay? We have micro markets and we have macro markets, okay? Micro markets are individual markets, so it's basically markets for one particular good or service, while macro markets are markets for a particular good or service on a national level, okay? So it's not just going to be a single company like it would be here, but instead it would be all the companies that produce that certain good or service and how the demand and supply is affected by that for the entire nation. Again, we'll be looking more at this in way more detail later on, but just know that there is a difference in terms of markets and market structures throughout them. However, both of these topics are reliant on measuring the concepts of two things that are already highlighted here: change and well-being. All right, so easily one of the most important concepts you will need to understand throughout this course is going to be intervention, specifically government intervention, okay? Governments throughout the world, to varying degrees, intervene in markets and economies with their governmental policies, okay? So this is pretty straightforward. We have markets. Markets aren't perfect. Governments try to intervene in markets to make them more perfect, allegedly, but obviously there's a lot of messiness in there. It doesn't always work that way, and then governments are swayed to act a certain way due to politics, and it's a really, really messy topic. But theoretically, governments want to intervene in markets to make it better for the economy and society as a whole. Okay, and this concept evaluates economic well-being and sustainability. Okay, so basically it connects to how well is the economy doing. Okay, is inflation staying low? Is unemployment staying low? How well is the economy doing? Is it going to be sustainable for a long period of time as well? Is the products that we're producing, is it going to cause future generations to be compromised? What's going on here? Okay, so government intervention typically will intervene to meet at least one of these two objectives. Though, like I just said, that's not always going to be the case. Okay, and as we'll look at in way more detail later on, this concept is going to differentiate on micro and macroeconomics level. So for example, in micro, a form of government intervention will be taxes, okay, so taxes on cigarettes, for example. Whereas on a macroeconomic level, they might implement a monetary policy from the central bank. But again, we'll look at this in way more detail later on. All right, and now that we've looked at the chain of reasoning connecting all of the concepts already together in such a way, I would suggest to go ahead and start taking notes on all the concepts listed here as I go ahead and walk you through them. Okay, so since I already introduced you guys to the first two here, let's talk about the second two. Efficiency is a quantifiable concept determined by the ratio of useful output to total input. Allocative efficiency, which is a very important term, especially later on throughout the course, refers to making the best possible use of scarce resources to produce combinations of goods and services that are optimum for society, thus minimizing resource waste. Basically, like it said, at what point in the economy, or specifically at one point in each market, are resources being used in the most efficient way possible? In which way are they being allocatively efficient to produce the best amount of goods and services that make society the best or make society the happiest? Now, this next one is equity. Equity is not the same as equality, okay? For the longest time, I thought they were the same, but they are definitely not. And now is a good time to learn why. So equality would be, let's say you have the poorest person in Italy next to the richest person in Italy. Okay, obviously there's going to be a huge disparity between their income. But if you were to promote equality between them, you would give them the same salary, okay? You would give the richest person the same salary as you would give the poorest person the same salary. However, equity focuses on, hey, maybe we should give the poor person a bigger salary than the richest person so that he has more opportunities that the rich person already has. Okay, that's an example of how equity works. And now if we connect this to economics, it refers to the concept or idea of fairness and contributing fairness to society. Fairness is a normative concept as it means different things to different people, so it's completely subjective. And usually the subjective opinion of equity and fairness in general is usually up to the person making the economic decision. So for example, in any cases of government intervention, what they contribute and how they interpret fairness to be is going to be the most important, as they are the ones with the choice in their hands. Okay? But in economics, inequity is often interpreted to inequality, which may apply to, like I just said, the distribution of income, wealth or economic opportunity, okay, and much more. And the reason why this is a key concept is because inequity remains a significant issue both within and between societies. As we'll get into later on, there are many micro and macroeconomic objectives trying to promote equity, okay, both in terms of economic opportunity, distribution of income, and so much more. And I'm sorry, but I accidentally put sustainability on here twice. But then again, sustainability and change, here are their formal definitions. And here are also the definitions for interdependence and intervention. Okay, but all right, to continue, let's talk about something called factors of production, okay, also known as FOP. F and P are capitalized, O is not, okay? So when we talk about resources being used to make economic decisions and make economic choices, we have to define what are those resources. In economics, the resources used to produce goods and services are classified into 4 categories, known as the 4 factors of production, okay? Let me just put that right here. And the way I really like to remember the factors of production is actually via this acronym I made right here, okay, called MILK. So as long as you spell it like this and you remember the phrase MILK, you should remember them, okay? And that would stand for management, labor, land, and capital. So let's break them down, okay? So land includes all resources provided by nature that are used to produce goods. So this would be anything like fields to produce cotton or trees to produce palm oil, like from the example earlier. Okay? Capital, which is also referred to as physical capital, is the factor of production that includes all buildings, offices, factories, machines, and more, okay, to produce the goods and services. So capital is basically also known as physical capital or capital goods. So any excess goods that help the production of transforming land resources or other resources into the final product to take place, okay? Labor includes all human resources used in producing goods and services. So literally just whether it's manual labor used in cutting down trees or in planting apple seeds, and also intelligence labor, which is more focused on like, oh, people who do coding for websites, people who focus on graphic design. They aren't physically doing something super provocative in terms of producing a good, but rather they're using their intelligence to do something more simply than that. Okay. And lastly, management, also known as entrepreneurship, would be the organizing and risk-taking factor of production. Obviously, if you were in a society or in an economy that had absolutely no management or entrepreneurship, then nothing would change. So nothing would be invented and nothing would be innovated because everything would stay the same. So clearly, to develop products and develop technology to the extent that we have right now, we need people to be managers and to be entrepreneurs in society. Okay, so now the methodology of economics or economic models is going to be something that you're going to use throughout the rest of the course, I swear. Okay? A model is a simplification of reality, often expressed in the form of a mathematical analysis in equations or through a diagram. We use economic models for the basis of our analysis. Okay, so in simple words, a model is going to be a graph. Okay, so I'm going to draw something right here. We'll look at this in way more detail later on, but this right here, this right here is the basic model for almost, I would say, the majority of the graphs we're going to be drawing through economics, okay? Okay, so this is a basic demand and supply curve. Then we have a model that's a PPC curve, and then we have an unemployment curve. So obviously, don't worry, we're going to go through these much more detail, but just so you know that there's going to be a variety of economic models that relate to different parts of our course, okay? And every time I say models, economic models are graphs that we use and we design, okay? By definition, this means that other factors are left out or ignored, okay? So now because models are going to be a simplification of reality, we're going to make many assumptions about each of them, okay? And we'll discuss that in our evaluations of them. So that means that other factors are specifically left out or ignored, okay? It must also be acknowledged that in order to simplify complex reality, economics make these assumptions that I just said. Okay, so now for all the IB students out there, when you get to a place in either paper 1 or 2 where you're going to be analyzing graphs, whether in essays or in 4-mark questions, you're going to be using this phrase all the time, so go ahead and memorize it now. Ceteris paribus. Economists often use the ceteris paribus phrase or assumption. Okay, this term means when all other things are being equal. And don't worry, when we first start our main graphs, which is going to be this one and this one later on, I'll definitely use ceteris paribus in the explanation to show you guys how it would be used. But before we get a little too close to the sun and we start applying economics to real life, let's talk about the theory behind economics in general, okay? So on a general basis, economics is split between normative and positive. So normative economics is concerned with how things should be and necessarily involves subjective value judgments. So this right here basically tells you everything you need to know in the sense that subjective value judgments means that it's going to be a decision that all economic decisions that take place are going to be completely determined by the economic agents involved. Okay, and like I said earlier, kind of with how governments intervene to what they subjectively think is best for society, the economic agents that influence the economy, they're going to be making subjective value judgments, okay? And considering how normative economics is how things should be, this is theoretical, okay? This is basically the assumption that we should constantly be improving economics to be better, okay? According to a subjective value judgment. On the other hand, positive economics is concerned with describing and analyzing economic relationships and making factual and objective claims. So while this is way more theoretical and thinking, oh, we should do this, and we should do this, and we should change, positive economics is analyzing what is already there and is concerned with the facts, okay, making factual and objective claims about society and the economy and how it already is. Okay, all right. So as I mentioned just a few minutes before, we're going to be starting to look at economic models to display our key concepts. Okay, so we're going to start by introducing something called the Production's Possibility Curve. Okay, PPC for short. Okay, and as you guys might remember from me drawing earlier, it's the one that kind of looks like this. Okay, but let's go ahead and erase that for now. So let's start with definition, okay? The definition of a production possibilities curve is that it is a curve showing the maximum combinations of two types of output that can be produced in an economy in a given time period, if all resources in the economy are being used efficiently and the state of technology is fixed. So let's go ahead and break this down, okay? So on the y-axis here, we have agricultural output, and on the x-axis here, we have manufactured goods, okay? Oh, sorry about the X. Okay, we're just going to be using these two goods as a basis, but practically it shows the maximum combination of two types of output, okay? This can be anything, but for the most part, we're going to be using this, okay? So obviously, if you guys have ever studied math before, I'm sure you know what part of an axis this looks like, positive versus positive, okay, from 0 up and from 0 to the right. And every time we show a graph, it's going to be taking place in a specific time period, okay? And it's not always defined, but just know this is what's happening in a specific time period, okay? So let's talk about the actual curve itself now. It shows the maximum combinations of two types of output that can be produced in the economy. So agricultural output and manufactured goods. If we're thinking about this in a realistic and logical way to make manufactured goods possible, and we want to use all of the resources that we have to allocate to the production of manufactured goods, then we're going to have to use up all of them at point G right here, which means that all resources used to manufacture manufactured goods are going to be taken away from agricultural goods. So that means if we make as many manufactured goods as possible, then we're going to make this many manufactured goods wherever it is here, but then we're going to be making 0, okay, agricultural goods. And it's the same the opposite way around. If we want to make as many agricultural goods as possible, then we'll be making this much here. However, we'll be making 0 manufactured goods, okay? So if you think about it in this way, each point along this curve, we'll ignore these two for a second, each point alongside this production possibilities curve shows how output changes when changing how many resources are used for good X and good Y. So if we wanted to make only agricultural goods, we'd make none of this. And if we wanted to make only manufactured goods, there would be none of this. And every spot in between them is how much that would change. So for example, at point D, if I wanted to use maybe half my resources for manufactured goods, I'd make this many manufactured goods, and then the rest of those resources would allow me to make this many agricultural goods. So it's basically like a balance between them and such, okay? And any point on this curve is going to be the maximum that can be produced with the resources that we have, okay? And that connects to this part right here. If all the resources in the economy are being used efficiently and the state of technology is fixed, resources in the economy are being used efficiently. So basically, they are able to produce the most maximum output possible. And in this case, specifying that the resources are going to be efficient means that this curve isn't going to move because the resources that we already have are being used in the most maximized way possible, okay? And the state of technology being fixed just ensures that in this time period, some new innovation is not going to change this curve in any way, okay? So basically, it's just going to stay right here. This model illustrates the concepts of efficiency, scarcity, choice, and opportunity cost. So let's break this down for a second. Efficiency, basically it shows how resources are being used efficiently. Bam, it shows how they're being maximized, okay? Scarcity, it shows if we wanted to produce only agricultural goods, we would produce no manufactured goods and there'd be a scarcity of them. And the same with vice versa, okay? Choice, at what point do us, if we were producers, want to produce how much of each product? Okay, we have to make a choice. Do you want to produce this many more manufactured goods and agricultural goods, or this many more agricultural goods and manufactured goods? Okay, and obviously opportunity cost. If we're producing unit B right here, all the resources that we're using to produce so many agricultural goods is sacrificing the amount of manufactured goods that we can produce, therefore creating an opportunity cost in that. And the same vice versa. Okay, so now let's introduce these other 2 points that aren't actually on the curve and talk about what they mean, okay? So let's focus on this first one right here, point I. So now if this right here, if this curve is where we can logically operate as a firm to produce 2 amounts of product in the most efficient way possible, then what does it mean if a point is outside this curve? Well, obviously this would mean that this point would be out of reach of our productive efficiency that we have right here on this curve, okay? This point right here, point I, would be an aim for our firm to lean towards, okay? And rather that this point is completely unattainable as we are producing with the most maximized and efficiently used resources possible, but still we cannot reach that point I because we are stuck here on the curve. So rather, this represents scarcity, okay? Because there's a scarcity of resources used to produce an equal amount of both agricultural output and manufactured output, us as the firm, we cannot produce to this unattainable level right now. And in fact, we only include this point on the curve just to note to ourselves that it is currently unattainable, but hopefully in the future, with a shift of the curve perhaps, we can get there one day. Okay, so while this point might be unrealistic, this one is not, and this one we do not want to go towards. Okay, so point I, we want to go there, hopefully, although realistically it won't be possible. And for point H, realistically it is possible, but we do not want to go back down there. Okay, so now let me introduce you guys to a little bit more terminology. Okay, this curve right here is going to be known as productive efficiency. Okay, it's the point at which us as a firm can produce the most efficient amount of both products. Okay, so any point on this curve is productive efficiency. Okay, so if any point above this curve is out of our reach and is unattainable, then anything below it is going to be productive inefficiency. Okay, so I don't have space to write it right now. So let me go ahead and write this way over here. So if any point on this curve right now, we are being productively efficient, and any point inside, we are being productively inefficient, while any point right here, our resources are being maximized and used efficiently. If we were ever to move our curve more or less like through here, that would mean our resources are being completely inefficient. Okay, so that would connect directly to the key concept of efficiency. Okay, this is perfectly efficient, this is under efficient, and this is just unattainable in general. Okay, so while I went ahead and I cleaned off this graph a little bit and I brought us to a brand new clean slide, we're going to be introducing the idea of shifting curves. So that's a really key, not concept necessarily, but a key pattern you'll see in economic graphs. Okay, so while this curve is right here, we are constantly going to see examples of curves moving this way, maybe to the right, to the left, up and down, just every which way. Okay, so we're going to talk about this as of right now. So while the curve for our example is here right now, if there's a point H here, there's a possibility that our curve was actually once right here. And since we have been here, that's not a very good curve. It's supposed to be curved like this anyway. But if our curve ever was theoretically right here, but now it's here, that means it moved outward, okay? That means it improved, okay? So any shifts to the right or upwards are in general good shifts, and any curves to the left or down are bad shifts. So if we were at this place before where we were productively inefficient, but we moved to a place where we became productively efficient, that means we have experienced something in between here, okay, with this little arrow. Okay, that's called actual economic growth. Okay, I'm sorry, my handwriting is so big, I don't have space to write it on the actual graph, but these little arrows are going to be examples of actual economic growth, as we can actually move from this place to this place. Okay, so what we were talking about before, this is theoretical, okay? We wish we could get there, but we really can't. So while this isn't realistic, this is. So this is realistic economic growth that could have actually happened. And now, as you've seen, as I've put right here, important terms for potential output, okay? If this is how much we can actually move, how much could we potentially move? Well, potentially, if we were super lucky and we found a way to change our firm in some way, we could potentially reach point I, which would then change the curve to basically move upwards even more than before. Okay, so it looks something, that's still really wonky, I'm sorry. It looks something like this, okay? And then once again, all the way around, we would be increasing our original curve to this even bigger one. And so this part right here would be known as potential output. Okay, so actual economic growth and potential output are the names of the acts of moving in between these two curves. Okay, all right, so as we mentioned when we started introducing models, we said there are of course going to be some assumptions in making a model. After all, it is going to be a simplification of our reality, therefore nothing's perfect. Okay, so let's talk about some notable ones. The PPC model contains several assumptions. It is assumed that the economy produces only two goods, aka agricultural, and manufactured goods. Okay, that's why we only have to balance between two goods, X and Y. It's assumed that the resources in a state of technology are fixed. So like we just said, we're going to assume that resources are being maximized and they're being fixed. So we don't have any more or any less. Okay, and technology is fixed. So in this time period, technology is not going to play a part herein at all. Okay, it is also assumed that all resources in the economy are fully employed and are fully maximized right here. So as we've already related before, These 3 points already relate completely to our analysis of the graph we've seen. However, these are all assumptions because what are the chances that any and most definitely not all 3 of these are going to be true, okay? Try to name one company that produces only 2 goods, where the resources and state of technology are always fixed. Furthermore, how do we prove if all the resources in the economy are fully employed, efficient, or not? Okay? So, in general, these certain assumptions or generalizations are made to turn our reality into the theory to kind of explain it in such a way. Okay, so I'm sure at this point everyone's getting really annoyed at seeing this graph on the 4th slide, but I swear we'll almost be done with the PPC graph in a minute, after we talk about concept connections. Okay, this simple model may be used to illustrate the concepts of scarcity, choice, opportunity, cost, and efficiency. Now, I already explained this before, and you're like, why are you explaining it again? Stop wasting our time. But honestly, this basic model is pivotal. I cannot understate this enough. It is pivotal in understanding how models relate to key concepts later on. And this is super important because in most other graphs we talk about, we don't have enough time and we don't have enough explanation to reconnect to all of these theories into the rest of the concepts that we stated before. So as long as you understand how concepts relate to this graph on a general basis, you should be good to go in the sense that when you're writing your IA, when you're writing your written commentaries, you will know how to relate to these key concepts to a variety of different graphs later on. And finally, we don't have to look at that same curve anymore. We just have to talk about it, okay? So PPC, increasing the potential. If there's an improvement in the quality or an increase in the quantity of the factors of production or technological advancements, then the PPC will shift outwards from PPC1 to PPC2 as shown in the next graph. So before I show you guys the graph, I just want you to consider what this says, okay? Remember how before the graph looked like this and there's a point inside and a point outside, and this is where we want to be, but it's unrealistic at the moment? Well, the fact that we could shift actually to that point would turn us to PPC1 to PPC2, okay? But the only way that we can improve our resources efficiency even more than before is if there's an improvement in the quality, okay, in the quality or an increase in the quantity, okay? Those 2 terms are very important. In the factors of production or advancements, okay? So here's some specific examples of branching out the factors of production or technology. For example, changes in the educational system can improve the quality of labor. This would relate to the labor factor of production. Policies to increase immigration can improve the quantity and also the quality of labor. Once again, labor factor production. A better education population could develop improved technologies. Okay, this would improve to technology, not a factor of production, but still can advance our curve like this. And new forms of energy could be found or developed to increase the quantity of natural resources. Okay, this would relate to land. Okay, any of these changes would cause a shift in the PPC curve as shown right here. So if you aren't with me yet and you don't understand what's going on, don't worry, but I am going to be using some very specific terminology that you will see as a pattern is going to be used in everything moving on. So as I explained before, we have something called a shift, okay? Any point where a curve moves, like the whole curve moves, that is called a shift. So this is going to be a shift right here, okay? I gotta say, right, one of the worst things about the IB for sure is how picky they are in specific terminology for economics. So I'm going to be using the word shift right now, and later on you're going to hear me use the word movement alongside a curve. I won't get into that now, but just know that's different. But for now, when the whole curve shifts on the X and the Y axis, it's going to be a shift, okay? Now, taking what we said before, this is the original graph, and now this is going to be the shift in the graph to increase the potential. So although it's not shown here, point D, okay, point D is right there, point H is here, and point I is on this new curve that we've gone to, okay? So as told in the description, we're going to be moving something called PPC1 to PPC2. Now, when we label curves in economics, the first curve that we start off with, we just put a little 1 next to it. And the second curve, we just put a little 2 next to it for a very general basis, okay? This is going to change a little bit later on, but for now, just try to think about it like that, okay? So if we see here, any of these 4 points that could realistically be adapted into a firm could affect the shift in the PPC, okay? Increasing the potential, aka reaching that, what did we call it before? Potential output, okay? And as a last note, the word concave is going to be used to describe the shape of a PPC graph very specifically, okay? If you don't know what concave means, it basically just means curved. So while this PPC graph looks like this, most of the graphs we are going to be looking at are going to be linear, okay? They're going to look like that. For now, we're not going to use graphs like this, though. We're going to use concave curved ones, okay? So let's talk about why it is concave. Okay, why is it curved in the first place? Well, the difference in the opportunity cost increasing or decreasing makes this model concave. Okay, so as a quick explanation, as we said here, each point on this curve shows opportunity cost increasing or decreasing. Okay, so you have more opportunity cost for agricultural output here, and more opportunity cost for manufactured outputs here. Okay, and you see how, the amount of output changes between each point as you go further and further along the curve, okay? And just due to mathematical and logical reasoning, every time you plot one of these points and the opportunity cost increases or decreases for each product or good, you are going to automatically get a concave shape, okay? And when we simplify this into a model like this, we don't have to be specific about, for this one, the curve is more kind of like a flat curve like that. Okay, so realistically, if you have to draw a model in like an essay, you can just change a curve that looks like that to a curve that's just straight up like that, okay? So either way, they're both concave, and they're both concave for the same reasons. All right, finally, we can get off the PPC train. So let's talk about another sort of model right now. Although for this one, we don't necessarily need to memorize it, and we definitely do not need to draw it. Okay, let's talk about the circular flow of income, okay? This graph is really just used to help us understand how money moves through society in the first place. A model to illustrate how an economy might work is the circular flow of income model, as it can illustrate the interdependence, key concept from before, that exists between key economic decision makers. So to simplify it, because we're going to be starting the IB course with microeconomics, we're going to start with two main stakeholders, households and firms. And as we can see, they both contribute to each other in different ways. Okay, so let's start. What do houses give to firms? They spend money on goods and services to firms. Okay, so if a firm here is selling cupcakes, let's say it's a bakery, a household is paying for the cupcakes from the bakery, so they're spending expenditure, also known as just money, on the goods and services, okay? And in return, firms are returning wages, rent, interest, and profits to the people, to the labor of the people who work at their firms. They're returning the wages to the households, okay, back to the people themselves. So what that basically shows us here is how households contribute to firms, and then firms in turn contribute to households, and it just goes in a cycle. Okay, this is once again shown right here, okay, but vice versa. Houses contribute factors of production to firms, such as labor right here, or perhaps they're going to give land, rent some capital or whatnot, but they're going to contribute to factors of production in some way. And in terms, firms can produce the goods and services that households want and will want to buy, okay, and then once again, this is a cycle within itself. And although we do not need to know how to draw this graph per se, there's obviously going to be some assumptions, okay? Now, as we just saw, this is a very simple model containing only two sectors, okay? The sectors would be the firms and the households. Okay, so firms and houses. Okay, and while on your computer, this looks super simple and super fine, in the real world, obviously everything is so much more complicated than this, okay? It also suggests that all income is earned by the household and is spent to domestically produced goods and services. Okay, so basically this just means that all income is sent directly to households and there is none taken out for tax purposes or anything, and that all money and all income that households get automatically spend it on production goods and services from the firms. Although clearly households and firms are not the only two sectors acting in an economy, and consumers do not spend all their incomes on domestically produced goods. However, we can further expand on this model by introducing three additional sectors: the government, the financial sector, and the foreign sector. Okay, just to remind ourselves, economics connects to a basic extent of global and humanity concepts, as explored before, that all interconnect with one another, okay? And that can all be demonstrated using an even more complex circular flow of income. But before we actually take a look at this circular flow of income, we're going to introduce ourselves to two more key terms, okay? Let's start with leakages. Income leaves the sector via 3 additional sectors, okay? And all the income that leaves is known as a leakage, okay? And there are 3 types of leakage. So all 3 leakages connect in some way to at least one other sector, okay? So obviously when the income is leaving, it's leaving to go somewhere else. It's not just disappearing into thin air, okay? The 3 leakages include income leaving as taxes to government, income leaving as savings to financial institutions, and income leaving for imports, also known as the foreign sector. And while there are 3 different ways that income leaves our circular model, it also comes in 3 different ways. So the 3 sectors that we've already introduced, the government, the financial institutions, and the foreign sector, while they take away our money in some way, they also throw it back into the circular flow of income, okay? So all of the income that comes back in is also known as an injection, okay? There are 3 injections. These 3 injections would include government gives government pending, financial institutions give investments, and the foreign sector gives export revenue. So now let's look at all of these injections and leakages on an actual, developed, more complex circular flow of income graph. Okay, so now that we've talked about specifically leakages and injections, we can look at a 4-sector model. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, there's 5 sectors here. What's going on? But actually, when we look at it on a more complex model, this is going to be considered 1, this is going to be considered 2, this is considered 3, and this is considered 4. Okay, so in this case, households and firms are going to be connected together. And as we already explored before, we know how households and firms interact with one another. But since households and firms are associated with acting individually of the number 2, 3, and 4 added sectors, we include them as such, okay? So every way that the sector interact with this one and vice versa. So let's take a look at how money is introduced and leaves this first sector into the other 3, okay? By taxing households and firms, taxes make their way back into the government and they just stay there until governments return the favor to households and firms, government pending and returning that income in some way back into the sector. For financial institutions, which by the way, for anybody who doesn't know, it's just banks, okay? On a very general and basic level, we can just call them banks. Fancy word is financial institutions. However, they just use the term financial institutions because that usually encompasses more like commercial and central banks. But we'll get into that when we reach macroeconomics, okay? But when people want to save money and they want to save it for later, they save it in the banks. And then when banks agree to invest or to loan money to households or firms, it goes back into their sector, okay? And lastly, imports and exports. So we're going to be talking about this a lot more in macro, but imports is basically any goods that are shipped into a country from another country as they are bought by people inside the country, where exports are products that are shipped out of your country to sell to people in other countries, okay? So the foreign sector would relate to any other countries that is not the main country or economy discussed in this entire diagram, okay? So for example, if this takes place in Canada and these Canadians want to buy something from the US, then they're going to spend money on imports. They're going to be spending money on other products from another country to the foreign sector. And then when the foreign sector wants to buy back from Canada, they're going to be using revenue from exports to do that. So now that we've basically finished getting the 4-sector model out of the way, we're going to start the last section of this 1.1 unit, okay? Which is going to be rationing systems. Now, when you heard me explaining economic concepts earlier, you might have heard me use the phrase market economy structures or market economy systems, okay? And basically that refers to, if you recall to like 20 minutes ago, it refers to different theoretical structures that economists use to basically organize how they assume that economies should work from 2 very different perspectives. And the phrase market economy structures is just a fancy and kind of unspecific way to say a rationing system. Much rather use this term instead, okay? So economics is often referred to as the study of rationing systems. Since the resources in an economy are relatively scarce, there must be some way of rationing those resources and the goods and services that are produced by them. So basically, it's just the process of how do we ration and accurately allocate resources in our economy to the most efficient way possible and to benefit society the most, aka answering those 3 economic questions that we displayed before, okay? So economics is going to be based on the 2 theoretical rationing systems of planned economy and free market economy. So let's take a look. Okay, so to begin, planned economy. In a planned economy, sometimes called a centrally planned economy or command economy, okay? This one is probably specifically as common as using the phrase planned economy. so I would very strongly suggest keeping that term in mind too. Allocates decisions as to what to produce, how to produce, for whom to produce, and these decisions are all made by a central body, the government. Hence, they're planned by the government, and individual firms and individual consumers don't need to worry about it, okay? However, the quantity of decisions to be made, data to be analyzed, and factors of production to be allocated are immense. They're huge, okay? Think about this in terms of a macroeconomic context for a whole country, okay? If we were looking at it in that context, then a country having a planned economy would essentially just rely on the government to price everything, to sell everything, to get supplies for everything, to tell every producer how much to produce, where to produce, and who to produce it for. So you basically get a situation where it's like a dictatorship of an economy, okay? And since this is such an immense burden on whoever has to make all the decisions at once, this also makes central planning very, very hard, okay? And as a realistic evaluation point, planned economies are becoming more globally rare as it becomes increasingly difficult for the government to uphold the increasing amount of decisions required to support the economy. This actually makes sense if you think about it, because the economy, whether people like it or not, is growing in different ways every single day. And the idea that such a huge country with such a vast economy, for example, the US, would need one government to make all the decisions for every single market is essentially impossible to even consider when you think about such the immense burden that it would cause on anybody to take that on hold. So in contrast, there are also free market economies, okay? And in a free market economy, also sometimes called a private enterprise economy or capitalism, prices are used to ration goods and services. Hence, products are individualized and are categorized on their value based on prices that producers set themselves, okay? The free market system, in a nutshell, would be a self-rightening system in which you don't have one central body or the government making all these economic decisions, okay? All these economic decisions are based on the producers who make them and the consumers who buy them. So when consumers and producers work out to their best own interests, the market produces the best outcome for both, theoretically. And this is a very important point for people who support free market economies, because they're like, why would I let the government decide how many apples I should be allowed to buy when I don't think they know how many apples that I want? And so the idea of being in a free market economy is that if I ask the producer to produce me 10 apples, I buy 10 apples from him and I get 10 apples, then we both have the best outcome, okay? I get 10 apples and the producer gets paid for 10 apples, okay? And how could the government possibly know that when he doesn't know how many apples they want to produce and how many apples I want to buy? Okay. However, sometimes it does take a long time for resources to be reallocated from the production of one good or service to another. So that's an important point to make, because the thing is about planned economies is that while that huge burden and stress of planning literally the entire economy is on the government, that means that producers and consumers don't really have to worry about what's going on behind the scenes because they don't have to make those decisions anymore. So when they choose to engage in a free market economy, basically, they have to start planning everything for themselves. So a side effect of that might include it takes a long time for resources to be reallocated when producing a different good than before. And lastly, before we wrap up this lesson, let's take a look at how realistic these economies are, okay? In reality, all economies are mixed economies. What is different is the degree of the mix from country to countries, okay? This means that some countries are just a little bit planned and they're mostly free economies, where some countries are just a little bit of free economy and they're mostly planned, okay? And right here, I basically just screenshot the textbook here, but here is a list of disadvantages for planning economies and for free market economies. Okay, so let's just run through these super quickly, okay? You don't need to know every single one in immense detail, but let's look through them just in case. So start with free market economies, okay? Demerit goods, which we'll get more into when we start developing our knowledge on microeconomics way more. Demerit goods will be over-provisioned, driven by high prices and thus a high profit motive, okay? So demerit goods, anything like drugs or alcohol or prostitution will be over-provided, and because so many people will be searching for these goods and because they are most likely banned or illegal, then they are willing to pay a high price just to get access to them. And on the other side, you have merit goods, goods that society thinks are beneficial for it. However, since we're in a free market economy, society might not think that there are enough merit goods in it, okay? There might not be enough healthcare or education, for example, okay? And because, once again, it's all products are determined by prices here, Only those who can afford them can get them, okay? That especially applies to things like healthcare systems and education. Resources might be used up too quickly and the environment may be damaged by pollution, okay? Because in a free market economy, everybody can do to a certain extent whatever they want. A few different firms can all agree to just destroy one rainforest, for example, okay? Whereas in a planned economy, the government would be planning out, hey, you know what? Actually, maybe we shouldn't do this and we should find a different resource instead. But because there's so much competition and free market economies, they're all willing to risk things like environmental factors just to allocate more resources to the productions of their good. And on a realistic level, some members of society will not be able to look after themselves, okay? Whether because they have like a disability or they just won't be able to get high income ever, or such as orphans, the sick, and the long-term unemployed, and will not be able to survive. And since they're in a free market economy, who's going to look after them? Who's going to provision them product? Well, since it's not planned out and they basically have to fend for themselves, they don't have anybody to automatically take care of them, okay? And also with free markets, a huge problem going on, even right now, I can go ahead and name a few. Large firms may grow and dominate entire industries, leading to high prices, a loss of efficiency and choice, and excessive power, okay? Also known as monopolies and oligopolies, but once again, when we get to macroeconomics, we'll talk about problems with that way more. Okay. And lastly, disadvantages with planning economies. Total production, investment, trade, and consumption, even in a small economy, are too complicated to plan efficiently, and there will be a misallocation of resources, shortages, and surpluses. So one of the benefits of having everybody kind of do their own thing in free economies is the idea that they're all only really affecting themselves in the sense of planning out their own investment, trade, and production, okay? But when you have one body like the government planning that out for every single market, it is so easy for them to make mistakes, okay? It is so easy for them to misuse resources and to use too little resources or to use too much, okay? And because there's no price system in operation, resources will not be used efficiently. So resource inefficiency is also super common in planning economies, okay? Incentives tend to be distorted. Workers with guaranteed employment and managers who gain no share profits are difficult to motivate. Output and quality may suffer. So I'm going to connect this to something really interesting here, but if you've ever learned in the past in any humanities about the effects and problems with capitalism and communism, you can probably really quickly relate free markets to capitalism, planning markets to communism, okay? And one of the valuation points of communism, similar to planning markets, is the idea that if you know you're going to get anything anyway, then why would you work as hard, okay? You'd be unmotivated to do much more because you're not being rewarded specifically for your particular job or role in society. And then obviously one of the biggest red flags with planning economies is the dominance of the government may lead to a loss of personal liberty and freedom of choice. Now, while this might not sound like a very big deal, I want you to consider everything in your life is made by the same body, okay? It's made by the government, okay? And it's also the same people who also make your laws, control your taxes, and apparently now would make your food and your computer and your education systems and so much more. It would really make so many consumers feel very uneasy as if they didn't have freedom of choice, because in planning economies, there's going to be way less choice, because one of the beauty about free market economies is the idea that there's so many different firms trying to do the same thing that consumers can choose from whatever they want. However, in planning economies, there's not going to be the same competition for the same type of markets. So there's only going to be one or two firms still run by the same big economic agent that produces goods or services for the same market, leading to less consumer liberty and choice. And then obviously one of the biggest problems about governments running anything or involving themselves in the economy in general is the idea that governments may not share the same aims as the majority of the population, but by power may still implement plans that are not popular or even corrupt. So it's the idea that in theory, the government wants what is best for you, what is best for the economy, and what is best for society. However, in the real world, there's many reasons why this is wrong, okay? They can be politically corrupted, they can have second-line motives, and in excess, there are really just a million different ways in which they can just be corrupted to an extent that gives society not the best options and not make them the most well off. And before I bore you guys to death anymore, this will pretty much wrap it up for Unit 1.1.